Hey friend, night has fallen. The world outside your window has gone silent. The roar of traffic, the murmur of the crowds, have all faded away, leaving only the moonlight to rest quietly on your windowsill. Perhaps, like me, you find yourself in another sleepless night. Your thoughts, like scattered leaves in the wind, drift in the darkness, unable to find rest. That's all right. Now, I invite you to find a comfortable position and gently close your eyes. Let's take a long, deep breath. Inhale. Feel the air slowly fill your body. And now, slowly, exhale, letting go of all the day's fatigue and worries. Allow me to accompany you through this quiet time with a story, ancient and long. You don't need to try to remember, nor do you need to struggle to think. Simply relax, and let my voice be a warm stream, gently flowing past your ears. History is like a deep river, flowing silently through the dreamscape of time. It scours the foundations of empires and witnesses the birth of heroes. Sometimes it rages, sometimes it flows calmly, but in the end, all rivers meet in the ocean we call oblivion. Tonight, we will drift to a stretch of that river that glimmers with the light of ancient bronze. There, the sun is fierce, the sea is a brilliant blue, and the air is filled with the scent of olive groves, mingled with the heady scent of epic myths. In the east of this dreamscape lies a vast, sprawling land, like a slumbering giant whose shadow covers half the world. And across the sea, a few small, yet exceptionally bright points of light are scattered, shining stubbornly among the crags and islands. When that colossal shadow begins to slowly, inevitably, move to engulf those points of light, what happens? Don't search for the answer. Just relax and listen. And let this distant story be a small boat that carries you, gently, into the realm of sleep. In the long river of human history, there are moments that stand like great dams in the torrent of time, forcefully altering its course. In these moments, all of chance and necessity, all heroes and tyrants, all ideals and ambitions, converge on a single point and then erupt with violent force. Our story tonight is about one such decisive moment. Let us turn our gaze to the 5th century BC. On the eastern horizon, an unprecedented super-empire has arisen. It stretches from the peaks of India to the Nile Valley of Egypt, from the frozen summits of the Caucasus to the azure shores of the Aegean Sea. Its name is Persia, the Achaemenid Empire. The ruler of the empire is the king of kings, Shahanshah. In his eyes, the world is a strict pyramid, and he is its single glorious apex. All the peoples under his rule, regardless of their origin, are his bandaka, his servants and subjects. The will of the empire is his will. The glory of the empire is his glory. This is a colossal machine built on the foundations of absolute monarchy, centralized power, and an efficient bureaucracy. It is stable, prosperous, and possesses the most feared military force in the known world. And yet, on the western fringe of this great beast, on the other side of the Aegean Sea, lies a scattered and utterly different land. This is Greece. It is not a unified nation, but a collection of scattered pieces. Hundreds of city-states, known as the polis, are strewn like game pieces across the rugged mountains and blue islands. They share a similar language and worship the same pantheon of gods on Mount Olympus, yet they are in a constant state of conflict with one another, where envy, suspicion, and betrayal are commonplace. Here, there is no king of kings, only citizens, politai. In Athens, a radical new political experiment called democracy, demokratia, is taking root, where citizens in the public square decide the fate of their city with shards of pottery. In Sparta, the entire city-state is a massive military barracks, where a citizen's sole duty is to become a fearless warrior. In Corinth, commerce and wealth define the city's worth. On one side, a unified, orderly, divinely ordained Eastern Empire. On the other, a divided, chaotic, self-governing collection of Western city-states. One believes power comes from the gods, the other that it comes from the people. One sees the individual as a cog in the vast machinery of the state. The other regards the freedom and dignity of the individual as the very foundation of the polis. At the end of the 6th century BC, These two vastly different worlds had almost no contact. They faced each other across the sea like two parallel lines, destined never to meet. And yet, the gears of fate had already begun to turn, quietly. A fuse was about to be lit, and when it exploded, the entire classical world would tremble. This conflict would not merely be a struggle for land and wealth, but a final, ultimate showdown over what the world itself should be. The story begins on the eastern shores of the Aegean, with their Greek brethren living under the shadow of the Persian Empire, the Ionians. Ionia, one of the cradles of Greek civilization. It was the birthplace of the first philosopher, Thales, and the first historian, Hecataeus. The Greeks here were wealthy, intelligent, and cherished their Hellenic freedom just as fiercely as any other. However, with the expansion of the Persian Empire, they had the misfortune of becoming subjects of the King of Kings. The Persians were not cruel rulers. They allowed the Ionians to keep their own language and religion, but what they could not tolerate was self-rule. The Persian governor, or satrap, replaced the citizen assembly. Tyrants loyal to Persia replaced elected leaders. For the Ionians, accustomed to breathing the air of freedom, it was a slow, creeping suffocation. The seeds of discontent were buried deep in the heart of every Ionian citizen, waiting only for the right moment. In 499 BC, that moment arrived. The tyrant of Miletus, Aristagoras, a speculator, fickle but highly charismatic, feared punishment from the Persian king after a failed military expedition. To save himself, he made a desperate gamble. He would transform his own fear of the king into a collective hatred of the Persian Empire by all Ionians. He resigned his tyranny, declared the restoration of democracy in Miletus, and called upon all Ionian city-states to rise up against Persian rule. The flames of rebellion spread rapidly throughout Ionia. But Aristagoras knew that relying on Ionia's strength alone was an act of utter futility. He had to seek aid from mainland Greece. He first went to the strongest power on the continent, Sparta. He told the Spartan king, Cleomenes, "From the Aegean to the Persian capital of Susa is but a 3-month journey, and gold and silver are there for the taking." But the pragmatic Spartans had no interest in overseas adventures. When Cleomenes heard 3-month journey, he cut Aristagoras off without hesitation and coldly commanded him, "Before nightfall, leave Sparta." Rebuffed by Sparta, Aristagoras went to Athens. The atmosphere here was completely different. The Athenians had just overthrown their own tyrant and established a democracy. They had a near-fanatical passion for the word freedom. Aristagoras' speech struck the softest and proudest chord in their hearts. In the end, swept up by passion, the Athenians voted to aid Ionia. They sent 20 warships. The neighboring small city of Eretria sent 5. The historian Herodotus would later write grimly, "These ships were the beginning of the evils for both the Greeks and the barbarians." With their morale boosted, the rebels marched inland, captured the capital of the Persian province in Asia Minor, Sardis, and burned the magnificent city to the ground. The fire of Sardis was the final straw. When news reached the Persian capital of Susa, King Darius was enraged. He was furious not because a city was destroyed, but because his authority had been subjected to an unprecedented humiliation and challenge. And when he heard that a group of Athenians, a people he had never even heard of from across the sea, were involved, his fury reached its peak. Legend says he commanded a servant to repeat 3 times in his ear at every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." The empire's war machine began to slowly grind into motion. After 6 years of struggle, the Ionian revolt was crushed in a decisive naval defeat at the Battle of Lade in 494 BC. Miletus was razed to the ground, its men killed, its women and children sold into slavery. The Persian Empire demonstrated the price of rebellion with a bloody retribution. But for Darius, this was not nearly enough. His gaze had already crossed the blue Aegean Sea, locking firmly onto that city-state that had dared to defy his divine authority, Athens. An expedition of punishment was about to begin. Yet neither Darius nor the Athenians could have known at the time that this was not just a punishment, but the beginning of a great epic point. 490 BC. After 4 years of meticulous preparation, Darius's punitive expedition set sail. This time, he did not choose the land route through Thrace, but assembled a massive fleet to cross the Aegean, aiming straight for Athens. The army, led by Darius's nephew, Artaphernes, and an experienced Median general, Datis, numbered around 25,000 men, including elite Persian infantry and their vaunted cavalry. In Athens, panic spread like a plague. The Persian fleet was unstoppable, capturing Eretria, the city that had also aided Ionia. The city was burned, its people put in chains, awaiting transport to Persia. Now it was Athens' turn. The Athenians were caught in a dilemma. Should they march out to meet the enemy, or defend the Acropolis? To march out meant facing a numerically superior enemy with powerful cavalry on open plains, a battle with slim chances of success. To stay put meant watching their fields and villages be ravaged, only to eventually run out of food and water under siege. Among the 10 generals of Athens, a man named Miltiades stepped forward. He had once been a tyrant in the Thracian region and had dealt with the Persians before. He knew their tactics. He argued forcefully against all opposition, insisting on marching out to fight. His reasoning was simple. Waiting in the city would only allow defeatism to grow, leading to a collapse without a fight. Only by taking the initiative could they seize their one slim chance of survival. Persuaded by Miltiades, the Athenians decided to risk everything. They also sent their fastest runner, Phidippides, to Sparta for help. With astonishing endurance, Phidippides ran the 150 miles of rugged terrain in less than 2 days, arriving in Sparta. He pleaded with the Spartans. Men of Lacedaemon, Athens, the most ancient city in all of Greece, is on the verge of destruction. Do not stand by and watch it be enslaved by barbarians. The Spartans expressed sympathy for Athens' plight, but their reply was like a bucket of ice water. They were in the middle of the festival of Carnea, a holy period dedicated to Apollo. Until the next full moon, their laws forbade them from marching to war. The full moon was still 10 days away. 10 days was more than enough time for Athens to be annihilated. Athens was on its own. The Persians chose to land on the plain of Marathon, a calculated decision. The terrain was open, perfect for deploying their prized cavalry. The Athenian army, in contrast, was a force of pure heavy infantry or hoplites. They had no cavalry, no archers. Their entire hope rested on the solid wall of bronze shields known as the phalanx. The two armies faced each other for several days. The 10 Athenian generals, who commanded on a daily rotation, were divided and hesitant to attack. The Persians also seemed to be waiting for something. Miltiades astutely realized they might be waiting for pro-Persian factions within Athens to stage a coup. Time was not on Athens' side. On the day it was his turn to command, Miltiades made the most important decision of his life. Attack. On the morning of September 12th, for 90 BC, Miltiades deployed his army in a highly unusual formation. He knew the Persian center was their most elite force, while their flanks were weaker. So, he did the opposite of what was expected. He weakened his own center to a depth of only 4 ranks, while reinforcing his left and right flanks to 8 ranks or more. It was an extreme gamble, to use a fragile center to lure the enemy in. Advance! The order was given. 11,000 Greek hoplites began to run towards the Persian line, over a mile away. Herodotus records that this was the first time Greeks had dared to charge at the sight of Persian attire, the first time they had dared to face a numerically superior foe in a full-out charge. To the Persians, this suicidal assault by a small force with no cavalry or archer support was pure madness. The battle began. Just as Miltiades had predicted, his weak center buckled under the fierce assault of the Persian elites and was nearly broken. The Persians, thinking victory was at hand, pushed forward in a frenzied pursuit. But the trap had been sprung. Just as the Persian center surged forward and their formation fell into disarray, the powerful Greek flanks had crushed the weaker Persian flanks. At that moment, Miltiades gave the decisive command. A perfect double envelopment was formed. The pursuing Persian elites suddenly found themselves trapped on 3 sides. Their famed bows and javelins were useless in the crowded melee, and their wicker shields and short swords were no match for the long spears and heavy shields of the Greeks. The battlefield became a giant meat grinder. The Persian army completely collapsed. The defeated Persians fled back to their ships in a panic. But they had not given up. Their fleet sailed around Cape Saunion, attempting to attack the city of Athens itself while it was undefended. However, Miltiades had once again anticipated their move. He ordered his exhausted and blood-soaked soldiers to immediately begin a forced march back to Athens. When they arrived at the Phaleron Bay, they saw the Persian fleet appearing on the horizon. Seeing the Athenian army arrayed and ready on the shore, the Persians knew their surprise attack had failed. They finally and reluctantly sailed away back to Asia. The Battle of Marathon was over. According to Herodotus, 192 Athenians fell, their names inscribed on a stone monument to be honored as heroes. The Persians, however, left behind over 6,400 bodies on the battlefield. A tiny city-state at a negligible cost had defeated the most powerful empire in the world in a head-on battle. The significance of Marathon went far beyond the military sphere. It was like a bolt of lightning that tore through the clouds of fear hanging over the Greek world. It proved to all Greeks that the Persians were not invincible. It showed that free citizens, fighting to defend their homeland, could unleash a power that the whips of the King of Kings could never command. Legend holds that the messenger, Phidippides, ran from the plain of Marathon back to Athens, and after crying out, "We are victorious!" collapsed and died from exhaustion. This story may be a legend, but the spirit it represents, the spirit of running to one's last breath for the honor and survival of one's city, was forever seared into the soul of Athens. The First Persian War ended with an incredible Athenian victory. But everyone knew this was only the beginning. The King of Kings in his palace at Susa, who listened daily to the words, "Master, remember the Athenians," would not let this stand. A larger, more violent storm was brewing, and this time the entire Greek world would be drawn into it. The defeat at Marathon was a deep humiliation for Darius. He vowed to launch an expedition of unprecedented scale to completely flatten Greece. The empire's war machine was once again set in full motion. However, fate seemed to be on the side of the Greeks. Just as Darius was preparing his revenge, a massive rebellion broke out in the heartland of his empire, Egypt. Suppressing the Egyptian revolt took several years. In 486 BC, the great King of Kings, Darius I, died during the long wait for his vengeance. To his dying day, he was unable to remember the Athenians. The throne passed to his son, Xerxes I. Xerxes inherited his father's empire, and he also inherited his father's hatred. In his view, conquering Greece was not just about avenging his father, but about completing the final step of the empire's manifest destiny. He spent 4 full years gathering an army from the vast expanse of his empire and preparing supplies on a scale that beggared belief. And during this precious 10-year respite, what happened in Athens? Miltiades, the hero of Marathon, fell from grace after a failed expedition and soon died. A new name rose to the center of Athenian politics, Themistocles. He did not come from a noble background, but he possessed the sharp strategic vision of a hawk and the cunning political mind of a fox. Unlike most Athenians who were basking in the glory of Marathon, Themistocles clearly understood that Persia's revenge was inevitable, and that next time, the enemy would come by both land and sea. The miracle of a land victory like Marathon could not be repeated. He gazed at the sea surrounding Athens and came to a stunning conclusion. Athens' future was not on the land, but on the sea. At that very moment, fate once again smiled upon Athens. A new, incredibly rich vein of silver was discovered in the state-owned mines at Laurion. Overnight, the Athenian treasury gained a massive windfall of 100 talents. How to spend this fortune? A fierce debate erupted in the Athenian assembly. Most citizens argued for the traditional approach. Divide the money among all citizens. Each would receive 10 drachmas, a significant sum for an ordinary family. But Themistocles stood up. He argued against distributing the money and proposed a radical idea. Use the entire sum to build the most powerful fleet in the world, a fleet of 200 triremes. Themistocles knew that arguing based on a distant Persian threat would not persuade citizens eager for immediate gain. He used his political skill, instead hyping up the threat from their old rival, the neighboring island of Aegina, claiming a strong navy was essential to protect Athens' sea trade. This more concrete and immediate threat successfully persuaded the majority of citizens. The Athenians gave up their 10 drachmas and invested their entire fortune in the shipyards. It was an astonishing decision, made collectively by the entire citizen body, to sacrifice immediate benefit for a seemingly distant future. Meanwhile, seeking divine guidance, the Athenians sent messengers to the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. The priestess, the Pythia, delivered a terrifying prophecy from amidst the vapors. "Wretches, why sit you here? Flee, flee to the ends of the earth. All is ruined. Leave the sanctuary, and steep your souls in sorrow." This oracle threw Athens into a panic. They sent a second delegation, begging for a more merciful revelation. This time, the Pythia gave them the famous, ambiguous riddle. "Yet a wood-built wall will by Zeus be granted, to be uncaptured, a boon to you and your children." What was the wooden wall? The conservative elders believed it referred to the old wooden palisade of the Acropolis and argued for defending it to the last. But Themistocles offered his own, world-changing interpretation. The wooden wall of the oracle was the fleet they were building in the harbor. The gods were telling them to abandon the land and entrust the entire fate of their city to the moving wooden wall of their 200 ships. And so, history, woven from silver, ships, and prophecy, was quietly guided towards the future Themistocles had foreseen. Athens had placed its entire stake on the table for the coming century-defining gamble. 480 BC. The army of Xerxes' revenge had finally arrived. The historian Herodotus left an almost mythical description of this force. 1.7 million soldiers from 46 different nations, and 1,207 warships. These numbers are likely exaggerated, but modern historians estimate the Persian army at a minimum of 200,000 to 300,000, with over 1,000 ships. Even so, this was a number unimaginable in the ancient world. To allow his massive army to pass, Xerxes ordered 2 pontoon bridges to be built across the tempestuous Hellespont Strait. After the first bridge failed, an enraged Xerxes ordered the strait to be whipped 300 times and a pair of shackles thrown into the water as a punishment to the sea. He then had the engineers beheaded and ordered new ones to rebuild. He also commanded a canal to be dug through the Mount Athos Peninsula to avoid a repeat of the storm that had wrecked the first expedition's fleet a decade earlier. All of this was not just military preparation. It was a carefully orchestrated psychological campaign designed to show the Greek world, "I, Xerxes, am a god who can whip the sea and cleave mountains. To resist me is to resist Providence itself." Faced with this eastern flood that threatened to swallow everything, the once divided Greek city-states for the first time felt a true sense of shared peril. Led by Sparta, 31 city-states formed the Hellenic League, vowing to resist the invasion together. This was an unprecedented display of unity in Greek history. But how to resist? In the north, the allied Greek army had tried to hold the Vale of Tempe, but abandoned it upon realizing the Persians could bypass it through multiple routes. All of northern Greece, under the immense pressure of the Persian army, submitted, offering earth and water. Now the Persians were marching south along the coast. They had to be stopped or at least delayed. The eyes of the allies finally settled on one place, Thermopylae. Thermopylae, meaning hot gates. It was a narrow pass about 2.5 miles long, at its narrowest point only wide enough for a single chariot. It was the throat of central Greece. Here, the Persians' vast numerical advantage would be neutralized. It was the perfect choke point. But who to send? And how many? Sparta was once again constrained by the festival of the Carnea and the Olympic Games. Law and tradition again tied their hands. In the end, a compromise was reached. One of Sparta's 2 kings, Leonidas, would lead his 300 royal bodyguards north immediately to seize the pass as a vanguard. The rest of the allied army would follow in force after the festivals. Leonidas and the 300 men he chose were no ordinary soldiers. They were Sparta's finest warriors, and every single one of them was required to already have a living son. This meant that from the moment they departed, they had no intention of returning alive. This suicide squad of 300 Spartans, joined by other allied troops along the way, reached a total of about 7,000 men. They arrived at Thermopylae, repaired an old stone wall in the middle of the pass, and waited for the inevitable storm. Xerxes' army arrived. He found it unbelievable that such a pitifully small force was there to oppose him. He waited for 4 days, confident that this ridiculously overconfident group of Greeks would flee on their own. They did not. A scout reported back that the Spartans were out in front of their wall, combing their long hair, performing their pre-battle rituals. On the 5th day, Xerxes' patience ran out. He ordered the attack. The first wave consisted of Medes and Scythians. They charged the shield wall with a roar, but their assault was like crashing against a wall of steel. In the narrow pass, their numbers meant nothing. Their short spears and wicker shields could not penetrate the Spartan defense, while the long spears of the Greeks darted out like vipers from the gaps in the shields, each thrust taking a life. Leonidas commanded with perfect composure. The Spartans displayed their world-famous tactical discipline. They would feign a retreat, suddenly turning and pulling back to lure the enemy forward and break their formation. Then, at the perfect moment, they would pivot, reform the phalanx, and deliver a devastating counterattack on the disordered pursuers. After a full day of fighting, the ground was piled high with Persian dead, yet the bronze wall remained unshaken. Xerxes, watching from his throne, is said to have leaped to his feet in alarm 3 times. On the 2nd day, he sent in his elite royal guard, the Immortals. This was a force of 10,000 of the bravest Persian nobles, so named because if one fell, another was immediately chosen to take his place, keeping their number eternally at 10,000. The Immortals' attack also failed. Their courage was admirable, but their equipment and tactics were simply outmatched by the Greek hoplites in the unique terrain of Thermopylae. 2 days passed, and the Persians had gained nothing but catastrophic casualties. Xerxes was in despair. Just then, a local Greek named Ephialtes, hoping for a reward from the Persian king, came before him. He brought a piece of intelligence that would prove fatal. There was a secret mountain path that could bypass Thermopylae and come out behind the defenders. Xerxes was overjoyed. That night, he dispatched the commander of the Immortals with an elite force, led by Ephialtes, to follow the path. The way through was now open. When news of the betrayal reached the Greeks in the pass, they were plunged into panic. Surrounded, they faced total annihilation. Most of the allied commanders argued for an immediate retreat to save their forces. However, Leonidas made the decision that would echo through history. He allowed the majority of the allies to leave, preserving a flicker of hope for Greece. But he, his 300 Spartan citizens, and the 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans who voluntarily remained, chose to stay. Why did they stay? Perhaps because Spartan law forbade a warrior from retreating. Perhaps because the oracle at Delphi had prophesied that either Sparta would be destroyed, or a Spartan king must die for his country. Leonidas chose to fulfill that prophecy with his own life to save his city. But more importantly, he sought to buy time for the retreating allies with a magnificent sacrifice, and to show the entire Greek world a spirit that could not be conquered. The final battle began. Trapped on both sides, the Greeks no longer defended the wall but charged out into the open for a last, desperate assault. They were no longer fighting for victory, but for glory in death. When their spears broke, they drew their short swords. When their swords grew dull, they smashed with their shields and bit with their teeth. Leonidas fought at the very front and died a hero's death. A fierce struggle ensued over his body. Finally, the remaining Greek warriors retreated to a small hill, fighting back-to-back in a last stand. The Persians, no longer daring to approach these warriors from hell, surrounded them and, with a shower of arrows and javelins, buried the last man on the hill. The Battle of Thermopylae ended with the total annihilation of the Greek defenders. Militarily, it was a complete defeat, but spiritually, it was an unparalleled victory. 7,000 men had held off a massive army for 3 days. 300 Spartans had, with their blood, carved an eternal monument in history. They proved to Xerxes and to the world that a free warrior can be killed but never conquered. Many years later, the Greeks erected a stone monument on the battlefield of Thermopylae, inscribed with the immortal lines of the poet Simonides. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. The hot gates had fallen. The road to Athens was now wide open. The time bought with the lives of the heroes at Thermopylae was not wasted. While the navy fought a series of delaying actions at Artemisium, an unprecedented evacuation was underway in Athens. Themistocles, with his extraordinary powers of persuasion, once again convinced the entire citizen body. Abandon your homes, abandon your lands, abandon the temples of your ancestors. Because Athens is not made of stone and wood, but of the citizens of Athens. Their true city was the wooden wall of their 200 triremes. This was a revolution in thought. It elevated the definition of a city-state from a geographical place to a human collective. At the moment of life and death, the Athenians made the most painful and the most glorious decision in their history. They chose to trust Themistocles, to trust in their moving wooden wall. Athens, the great city, became an empty city. A few days later, Xerxes' army marched unopposed into Athens. He may have expected a fierce street-to-street battle, the glory of a conqueror. But what he found was a dead, silent city, as if cursed. The streets were empty, save for the dust kicked up by the wind. This eerie silence, more than the fiercest resistance, filled him with rage and humiliation. His fury was finally unleashed upon the Acropolis. On Xerxes' command, Persian soldiers set it aflame. The fire licked at the ancient temples, then quickly spread into a sea of fire. The great predecessor to the Parthenon groaned in the flames, its massive columns cracking and collapsing one by one. Thick smoke billowed, blotting out the sun. From the nearby island of Salamis, the Athenian refugees could clearly see the destruction of their spiritual home. They saw their sacred flames extinguished, their hallowed halls, which held their faith and glory, turned to ash. In that moment, countless people fell to their knees, wailing in anguish. This was Athens' darkest hour, the moment the Greek allies' morale was at its lowest. Xerxes stood on the scorched ruins of the Acropolis, surveying the masterpiece of destruction he had wrought. He believed he had utterly broken the will of Athens. He dispatched a messenger on a fast horse to ride across the empire to Susa, to announce that his father's vengeance was complete. However, he did not know. The fire, far from destroying the Athenians' will to resist, had forged their grief and rage into an unbreakable resolve for revenge. He did not know that he had personally led himself and his invincible fleet into a massive trap laid by Themistocles, with the entire city of Athens as the bait. The decisive power in the war had now shifted irrevocably from the land to the sea, and the final judgment would take place in the waters right before the Athenians' eyes. The narrow, winding, and treacherous Strait of Salamis, the fall and burning of Athens brought the allied Greek fleet, gathered at Salamis, to the brink of collapse. The nominal commander of the fleet was the Spartan Eurybiades. He and the commanders from Corinth, Megara, and other Peloponnesian states were frantic. With Athens lost, they saw no point in remaining. Their only thought was to immediately withdraw the fleet to the Isthmus of Corinth, link up with the army, and defend their own homes. A fateful war council was held, lasting through the night, in the flagship's cabin. Themistocles saw the situation with perfect clarity. He knew that if the fleet left Salamis, it meant total defeat. In the open Aegean, the Greek fleet's disadvantages, fewer ships, slower speeds, would be exposed, and they would be picked off one by the Persian navy. And once the navy was gone, the land defenses at the isthmus would be nothing more than a Maginot Line, easily bypassed by sea. The fate of Greece at this very moment depended on the unity of this fleet. He used all his rhetorical skill to explain the advantages of a decisive battle in the narrow Strait of Salamis. Here, the Persian fleet's vast numbers would be unable to deploy. Instead, they would become congested, collide with each other, and their command structure would collapse. Here, our heavier but sturdier ships, and our sailors who were superior in close-quarters combat, would be at their most effective. the argument reached a fever pitch. The stubborn Spartan commander, Eurybiades, enraged by Themistocles' aggressive arguments, even raised his staff of command, threatening to strike him. Facing the raised staff, Themistocles, unfazed, spoke the immortal words, "Strike, but hear me." His powerful presence stunned everyone into silence. But he knew that debate alone could no longer change the minds of the Peloponnesians, determined to defend their homes. The vote was to retreat. Seeing the alliance about to disintegrate, Themistocles made the most audacious, cunning, and brilliant decision of his life. He would use the enemy's own hand to bind his allies. He summoned his most trusted tutor, a Persian slave named Sisinus, and gave him a secret mission. Sisinus boarded a small boat and quietly slipped through the night towards the Persian camp. He was brought before Xerxes and, as instructed by his master, played the part of a loyal informant. "My master, Themistocles, the general of the Athenians, is in his heart loyal to the great king," he said. "He has sent me to tell you in secret. The Greeks are terrified and are planning to flee under the cover of darkness. If you immediately send your fleet to block both ends of the strait, you can trap them all." This intelligence was a godsend to Xerxes. It perfectly confirmed his perception of the Greeks as cowardly and disunited, and it satisfied his own arrogant desire for a quick, decisive victory. Without a shred of doubt, he gave the order. Throughout the night, the massive Persian fleet was in motion, its sailors sleepless. Xerxes even landed an elite force on the small island of Citylea in the strait, ready to slaughter any Greek survivors who might swim there after the battle. On a high hill overlooking the strait, a golden throne was set up for him. The next day, he would sit there and personally witness his fleet crush the last remnants of Greek resistance. He did not know that the pot he was preparing was for himself. On the morning of September 28th, for 80 BC at dawn, as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the sea, the Greek fleet did not scatter and flee as the Persians expected. Instead, it began to slowly advance out of the bay. The sailors sang the sacred paean, a war hymn to Apollo, in unison. The song was powerful, echoing across the strait. "O sons of the Greeks, go on. Free your country, free. Your children, your wives, the altars of your ancestral gods, and the tombs of your forefathers. Now is the battle for all, the most important naval battle in ancient history, the Battle of Salamis, had begun." The Persian fleet, crowding into the narrow strait, quickly fell into the nightmare Themistocles had predicted. Too many ships, not enough space. The frontline ships tried to backpedal while the rearline ships pushed forward, throwing the entire fleet into a state of chaos and paralysis. They became a huge, clumsy target, and the Greek triremes were like a pack of wolves let loose among a huddled flock of sheep. Using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, they viciously rammed the vulnerable sides of the Persian ships below the waterline with their bronze-sheathed prows. In the bay, the crash of splintering timbers, the dying screams of soldiers, the futile shouts of officers, and the cries of men struggling in the water all blended into a symphony of death. The sea was quickly stained red with blood and the debris of ships. Xerxes, sitting on his golden throne high above, watched it all unfold. He was not witnessing a glorious victory, but a one-sided slaughter. He watched his invincible fleet trample itself in confusion, crashing into one another. He watched his bravest commanders sink, one by one, to a watery grave. When the sun set, the battle was over. The wreckage of over 200 Persian warships littered the surface of the sea. The Greeks had lost fewer than 40. The main body of the Persian navy had been annihilated in a single day. The victory at Salamis was decisive. It not only saved the Greek navy but also shattered Xerxes' will to fight. The fleet he depended on to supply his massive army and secure his own retreat was destroyed. For the first time and the last, he felt true, gut-wrenching fear. He was terrified the Greeks would pursue, destroy his bridges at the Hellespont, and trap him and his remaining army in Europe. This king of kings, who not long ago could whip the sea and cleave mountains, now had only one thought in his mind: escape. The crushing defeat at Salamis sent Xerxes fleeing north in a panic, leading his remaining fleet and the bulk of his army back to Asia. His ambition to conquer the world had sunk with his warships to the bottom of the Aegean. But the war was not over. Xerxes left behind an elite force led by his most trusted general and brother-in-law, the brave and capable Mardonius. This army, which included the Immortals, Medes, Sakas, and other core fighting units of the empire, numbered around 100,000 men. They would winter in northern Greece, in Thessaly, and prepare for a final land battle in the spring, hoping to turn the tide. Mardonius was a more pragmatic and dangerous opponent than Xerxes. Knowing that brute force alone might not conquer Greece, he turned to political maneuvering. He sent an envoy to Athens with a generous offer. If the Athenians would leave the Hellenic League and ally with Persia, he would not only help them rebuild their city, but would also grant them new lands and guarantee their complete autonomy. It was a tempting offer. Athens was in ruins, its citizens displaced. Accepting would mean a peaceful return home. The Spartans, hearing of this, were terrified and immediately sent their own envoys to Athens, begging them not to betray the cause. An Athenian elder, facing the envoys from both Persia and Sparta, gave a reply that would go down in history. Go and tell Mardonius that as long as the sun follows its course, the Athenians will never come to terms with Xerxes. We will resist him, relying on the gods and heroes whose temples and homes he has burned, and we will have our revenge. And as for you, Spartans, we understand your fears. But know this, there is not enough gold in all the world, nor any land so fair, that would make us sell the freedom of Greece. Athens chose to stand and fall with all of Greece. In the summer of 479 BC, the largest hoplite army in Greek history assembled at Plataea. The Spartans, this time with no religious festivals as an excuse, sent their entire force of 5,000 citizen soldiers under the command of their regent Pausanias. Along with 8,000 Athenian hoplites and troops from more than 20 other city-states, the total allied Greek force numbered an astonishing 110,000 men. Facing them was the equally massive elite army commanded by Mardonius. The two armies faced each other for more than 10 days, the atmosphere thick with tension. Mardonius, using his superior cavalry, successfully cut off the Greek supply lines and fouled their only source of water. The allies, facing starvation and thirst, were forced to attempt a nighttime withdrawal to a new position. However, coordinating a multi-state army in the dark was a disaster. Orders were confused, and the movements of the various contingents became completely disjointed. At dawn, Mardonius saw that the main Greek positions were empty, with only the Spartans exposed on the plain. He believed the Greeks had lost their nerve and were in full retreat. He gave the order for his entire army to charge and pursue the fleeing Spartans. However, what they were pursuing was not a group of fugitives, but a cornered lion. The Spartan commander, Pausanias, facing an enemy that outnumbered him many times over, remained calm. He ordered his men to form a phalanx and prepare for the impact. After performing the pre-battle sacrifices and receiving a favorable omen, Pausanias looked up, a glint of resolve in his eyes. He gave the command that every Spartan soldier had been waiting for: advance! In that moment, the Spartan phalanx, the most terrifying war machine of the ancient world, came to life. 5,000 Spartans and their Tegean allies let out a single unified roar, leveled their spears, and charged with unstoppable momentum towards the center of the Persian line. It was the ultimate showdown of classical warfare. When the Greek spear phalanx collided head-on with the Persian light shield infantry, the result was never in doubt. The Spartan spears easily pierced the wicker shields and linen armor of the Persians. Their shield wall, like a moving fortress, pushed forward, crushing and grinding the Persian lines. Mardonius and his 1,000 elite bodyguards fought bravely on horseback, trying to turn the tide. He personally killed several Spartans and was the most courageous warrior on the field. But at that moment, a Spartan soldier struck him hard in the head with a rock. Mardonius fell from his horse, dead. With their commander slain, the morale of the Persian army instantly shattered. Their last will to resist vanished with Mardonius's death. A full-scale rout began. The rout quickly turned into a massacre. It is said that on the very same day, across the Aegean Sea on the coast of Asia Minor, the allied Greek fleet landed at Mycale and won another decisive victory against the remnants of the Persian navy. The twin victories of Plataea and Mycale brought a final end to Persian ambitions of conquering Greece. The invaders were completely and utterly driven from Greek soil. The Greco-Persian Wars, a conflict of civilizations that had lasted for nearly half a century, finally came to a close with an incredible total victory for the Greeks. The victory in the Greco-Persian Wars meant far more than the outcome of a few battles. It was like a floodgate opening, ushering in an era for the Greek world, and especially for Athens, that was unparalleled before or since, the Golden Age. The removal of the external threat and the immense self-confidence gained from defeating a super-empire acted as a catalyst, unleashing the latent creative genius of the Athenians. For the next 50 years, this city became the sun of the entire civilized world. Philosophy, tragedy, comedy, democratic politics, sculpture, architecture, history. In almost every field, the brightest stars in the constellation of human civilization were all lit at this time in Athens. Athens, by virtue of the supreme prestige and unbeatable navy it had built during the war, formed the Delian League. This military alliance, originally created to continue the fight against Persia, gradually transformed into Athens' de facto maritime empire, using the tribute of its allies to adorn itself as the school of all Greece. And for the once invincible Persian Empire, this defeat marked the beginning of its long decline from its zenith. Its myth of invincibility was shattered. Although the empire remained vast and wealthy, its western frontiers were never again secure, and internal rebellions and brutal court intrigues, like wounds that would not heal, began to continuously erode the foundations of this colossal state. 150 years later, another young man from the north of Greece, from Macedon, Alexander, would follow the path Xerxes had once trod, but in reverse. With lightning speed, he would conquer and put an end to the empire that had once threatened to devour the entire Western world. But that is another equally epic story. Looking back on this half-century of war, what we see is not just the charge at Marathon, the blood at Thermopylae, or the great waves at Salamis. What we see is the victory of an idea, the victory of a worldview. It proved, in the most extreme and bloody fashion, that a collective of free citizens, willing to take responsibility and fight for their way of life, could unleash a resilience, wisdom, and creativity that a vast empire, held together by the will of a monarch and hierarchical servitude, could never truly understand nor completely conquer. The Greco-Persian Wars injected the core spiritual DNA into what would later be called Western civilization. A reverence for individual liberty and dignity, an emphasis on civic duty